A Trojan, to get installed on a system, uses a technique of masquerading itself in something else. For example, a couple decades ago with NetBus, it looked like Whack-A-Mole. The user installed Whack-A-Mole, and they got as a freebie the malicious software installed as well. And in the context of Trojans, a wrapper is the process of binding the malware inside or linking it to an otherwise innocent application, such as Whack-A-Mole or something else the user would want to install. And there's a lot of different apps that make it very easy to do that wrapping. And as far as types of Trojans, it's very similar to the types of malware. Because as we already know, a Trojan is an example of malware. And so the types of malware that could be living or residing, for example, on this computer or that computer, would include a VNC Trojan. VNC is a remote control application. So that the attacker out here on the internet, if the Trojan is running, the goal is to get a connection between the computer being attacked and the attacker so we can have remote access, remote control of that system. And the general concept behind a Trojan that gives you remote access is called a RAT, a Remote Access Trojan. And there's lots of different flavors of those. For example, we could leverage HTTP, in which case we'd have an HTTP-based Trojan. And one of the tricky aspects is this little guy right here, the firewall. The firewall is not going to let an attacker from the outside go to the inside network. However, that firewall at the same time will let users initiate connections going outbound to go to a web server on the outside and will dynamically, due to its stateful nature, allow the reply traffic. So if we want to set up a Trojan that gives us connectivity, if we can have that computer initiate the connection out to the attacker, the firewall says, oh, it looks like an HTTP request. And then when we respond back, it can look like normal HTTP traffic. That's if we have a fairly moderate firewall that's not checking too hard. But what's really going on behind the scenes is we have a remote connection that's allowing the attacker to have access to the internal computer. And behind the scenes, just a little bit, the attacker also doesn't want to have his real IP address involved. So the attacker will tunnel out to a service on the internet, and let's say he has an IP address of 23.1.2.3, and his real address, let's say it's 72.1.2.33. And he's got a tunnel between himself and this site. And then he can use a feature called dynamic DNS and get a host name, like host 572.418 dot something for the domain. And then when the attacker creates the Trojan will be directed to connect back to this host, which will do a DNS resolution for that host, which will go back to this IP address, which will then go back to the attacker. And if that address changes tomorrow to 23.1.2.130, the dynamic DNS will be updated regarding this host. And so tomorrow, when the computer does a name resolution of that host, it'll go back to the new IP address. And that way the attacker can hide his identity as he's facilitating these remote connections over to the victim. So continuing on our list of the various types of Trojans, we have ICMP Trojans, which are going to be using ICMP looking traffic. So if the firewall is allowing ICMP and it's not looking too hard, it might allow that traffic to go through. We have Trojans that hide data, for example, hide files on a system. We could have Trojans that are using HTTPS, which is great because the contents are encrypted. So it's very tough for a device that doesn't have the keys involved to decrypt the stream and take a look at the content to see what's really there if they're using HTTPS. Now, there are ways around that with the right firewall, but by and large, it's a pretty good way to hide data because the entire session is encrypted. Some Trojans are destructive in nature, where they're defacing or changing applications or websites. We might have Trojans that are assisting a botnet to be developed. So if we have 50,000 PCs all running an agent that are part of a botnet, that botnet could be deployed as a Trojan. We have proxy Trojans. And that's kind of sad because if a computer is running a proxy Trojan, it and many other computers like it could be used by attackers for the actual launching of attacks. So the attacker connects to the proxy is then being used as the source IP address that the internet sees for the malicious attacks. There could be FTP Trojans that allow the attacker to use the system as an FTP server. There are specific Trojans just to attack banking systems. There's Trojans that facilitate covert channels. And a covert channel is a channel that's being used in an unintended way. For example, if a firewall has rules that say SMTP is allowed, HTTP, HTTPS is allowed, and then the Trojan is actually using those ports and protocols. For example, TCP port 80 for HTTP and TCP port 443 for HTTPS. But instead of using that for just web services, we're using it for remote control of a system. That would be an example of an unintended use or hidden functionality regarding those ports and protocols. We could have Trojans that operate at the command line or command shell. CLI is an acronym for command line interface. We could have Trojans on mobile devices, and we could have Trojans that are looking for specific things. A Trojan could be sitting on this computer and going through the entire file system looking for the phrase password or looking for the phrase credit card, and then collecting the information following that, putting it in a file, and then sending it out to the attacker. Whether it's tunneling it out ICMP or FTP or masquerading as HTTP, those are all methods that Trojans could use to compromise a system and leak out data, including personally identifiable information, or PII, out to an attacker that otherwise shouldn't have that information. In our lab environment, as an example of how we can gain remote access via a Trojan, let's use an application called HTTP RAT. And again, the RAT stands for Remote Access Trojan. So with this tool, we can actually create an executable that will be the server, and we can install that on the victim's computer. Now, to actually deploy it, what we do is we could wrap that up, use a wrapping application, have the user click on the innocent-looking application, and then get that application installed, plus the Trojan behind it. For this brief example, however, I'd like to just go ahead and create the executable, which will make our Windows 8 the server, and then we can go to our control machine. For example, let's say it's Windows 10, and just open up a browser, http:// the IP address of our Windows 8 machine, and have remote access and remote control of that Windows 8 machine that's running the server. So in the case of Trojans, the server functionality is running on the victim, and the attacker is running the client portion. In this example, the client portion is simply using a browser to connect to the HTTP Trojan. So for convenience, here at the Windows 8 machine is where I'm going to go ahead and create the server executable, and we'll simply run it here on the Windows 8 computer as well. Also, oh my gosh, I feel like I need to take 2 showers after Googling and looking for remote access Trojans. Because I'll tell you what, there's a ton of them out there. However, most of them have embedded Trojans as part of them. So if you install a Trojan that has a Trojan, you're going to have an infected machine. So one way of verifying when you download software is you'd want to verify what the MD5 hash is for the original file, and make sure the MD5 hash on the file you downloaded matches. If the hash is different, that means that file has been tampered with. So after much searching and looking, I have HTTP RAT, which doesn't itself have a separate Trojan in it, and we're going to use that for the demo. So in your lab environment, that's another great reason why you would never want to run this on a production system, because you're likely to get infected or compromised on that system when you're out in the wild downloading and installing applications which haven't been verified. So we'll launch HTTP RAT. There's an option here so that when a user actually runs the server portion, it can send an email to the attacker, so you can go ahead and be aware that there's a victim ready to go. In our lab environment, I'm not going to send a notification with the IP address, and I'm simply going to click on Create. And that created HTTP server.exe. And we'll click on OK. So then we could wrap this in another application, have our victim run it, and have it installed. For our demonstration right now, I'm simply going to run the Trojan directly by launching it. So I double clicked on it. I don't see anything. But if we bring up Task Manager, so we'll go down to the taskbar, we'll bring up Task Manager, click on More Details, and then take a look at the running processes. And right here we have HTTP server 32-bit that's running. So it's running on the system, and now all we need to do is simply connect to this computer via HTTP, and we've got remote control of this machine. So that server is running on this host right here, Windows 8 at .208. Let's jump on the Windows 10 machine and simply open up a browser over to http:// and the 192.168.1.208 address of that Windows 8 now HTTP server. So on our Windows 10 computer, we'll go ahead and launch Chrome, and we'll open up a browser to http:// 192.168.1.208 and press enter. And we're there. Welcome, it says, to the http://rat infected computer. So if we click on the link for running processes, it'll give us all the running processes. We could click on the kill link to stop those processes. I also see down here at the bottom we have our http server.exe, which is what's causing this functionality. That's the Trojan. If we click on browse and we want to look at the various drives, we can click on drive C, and that gives us some access. If we click on users, there's Bob, there's downloads, and that is not responding. I think the HTTP server crashed. Let me go back and check it real quick. So we'll go back to the Windows 8.1 machine. Sure enough, it says HTTP server exe has stopped working. We'll close the program, and I'm going to go ahead and launch it again. Let's go back to that folder, which was in downloads, and we'll launch the server again. All right, so we got it running. Let's go back to our Windows 10 machine and reload that page. There we go. So there's the downloads folder for Bob. There's our secrets.txt.txt from an earlier nugget. I'll expand this. And if we click on that link for secrets.txt.txt, it'll go ahead and open it for us. And that's the contents, ABC123. We also have options for downloading. So if we click on the link for Spy Agent 9 and click on that, it'll download it to our local computer. We also have some options for execute and deletion of files as well. In this nugget, we've discussed several types of Trojans and did an example of a Trojan and how easy it is to compromise a system that has a Trojan running. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.